Net zero commitments have become a central feature of corporate climate strategies, but their credibility depends on the quality of supporting governance, planning, and implementation mechanisms. Private sector actors strengthen credibility by establishing science-based targets aligned with recognized climate pathways, integrating climate objectives into corporate strategy, assigning board-level oversight, and linking management incentives to climate performance. Organizations are increasingly expected to disclose emissions comprehensively, including Scope 1, Scope 2, and Material Scope 3 emissions. Independent verification, transparent reporting, and regular progress updates further enhance credibility. These practices help stakeholders distinguish genuine climate commitments from greenwashing or overly optimistic pledges that lack realistic implementation plans. A credible net zero strategy requires more than a distant long-term target. Organizations must demonstrate how emissions reductions will be achieved through detailed transition plans, capital allocation decisions, operational changes, and technology deployment strategies. Effective plans identify emission sources, prioritize reduction opportunities, evaluate climate risks, and establish accountability mechanisms. Many organizations also participate in voluntary climate initiatives and sector-specific alliances that provide frameworks, guidance, and benchmarking tools. These mechanisms increase transparency and consistency while helping organizations align climate commitments with stakeholder expectations. As scrutiny of climate claims increases, stakeholders increasingly focus on implementation evidence rather than public announcements alone. Net zero pathways provide structured roadmaps showing how emissions can decline over time while remaining consistent with long-term climate objectives. These pathways are based on scientific assessments, climate models, and sector-specific decarbonization assumptions. They identify expected emissions trajectories, technology requirements, energy system changes, and policy developments necessary to achieve climate goals. Organizations use net zero pathways to evaluate strategic options, assess future risks, and determine the pace of required emissions reductions. By comparing current performance against recognized pathways, companies and investors can assess whether climate strategies are aligned with global objectives and whether additional action may be necessary to remain on track. Interim targets are essential because net zero commitments often extend several decades into the future. Without near-term milestones, long-term targets may lack accountability and practical relevance. Interim targets typically cover 5 to 10-year periods and establish measurable emissions reduction objectives that support progress toward ultimate net zero goals. These targets enable organizations to monitor performance, adjust strategies, and demonstrate continuous improvement. Investors and regulators increasingly view interim targets as indicators of commitment credibility because they require concrete actions rather than distant aspirations. Effective interim targets should be specific, measurable, science-based, and integrated into corporate planning, investment decisions, and operational management processes. A variety of metrics are used to track net zero progress at both company and portfolio levels. Common measures include absolute greenhouse gas emissions, emissions intensity, carbon footprint, financed emissions, renewable energy usage, energy efficiency improvements, and progress toward emissions reduction targets. Organizations also monitor emissions by scope category and evaluate performance relative to baseline years. These metrics help stakeholders assess trends, compare performance across organizations, and determine whether emissions trajectories remain consistent with climate objectives. Effective measurement systems provide transparency, support accountability, and enable informed decision-making regarding climate strategy, risk management, and capital allocation activities. Portfolio alignment tools help investors evaluate whether investment portfolios are consistent with net zero objectives and climate pathways. Common approaches include measuring weighted average carbon intensity, financed emissions, implied temperature rise metrics, climate value at risk CVR, and scenario-based alignment assessments. Investors use these tools to identify high emission exposures, assess transition risks, evaluate decarbonization progress, and support engagement activities with portfolio companies. portfolio alignment methodologies increasingly incorporate forward-looking information, such as emissions reduction commitments, capital expenditure plans, and climate strategies. These tools enable investors to assess not only current emissions profiles, but also future alignment with climate goals. The net zero disclosure landscape has evolved rapidly as investors, regulators, financial institutions, and civil society demand greater transparency regarding climate commitments and performance. Organizations are increasingly expected to disclose governance structures, climate strategies, emissions data, transition plans, scenario analyses, risk management processes, and progress toward climate targets. Disclosure frameworks seek to improve consistency, comparability, and decision usefulness while reducing information gaps. Enhanced disclosures help stakeholders evaluate climate-related risks and opportunities, assess commitment credibility, and understand how organizations are responding to evolving climate expectations. Transparency has become a fundamental requirement for maintaining stakeholder confidence and supporting informed capital allocation decisions. Numerous stakeholders influence and rely upon the net zero disclosure ecosystem. Investors use climate disclosures to evaluate risk exposure, portfolio alignment, and long-term value creation potential. Regulators develop reporting requirements and supervisory expectations to improve market transparency. Financial institutions assess climate risks when making lending, underwriting, and investment decisions. Corporate boards and management teams use disclosures to communicate climate strategies and demonstrate accountability. Civil society organizations, customers, employees, and rating agencies also rely on climate-related information when evaluating organizational performance.